Welcome back. Richard, today is one of our favorite topics. One of the
It is indeed.
One of the most controversial topics, especially in the geographic region that we live in. But a hot topic, an important topic that we talk about often, at least in therapy sessions and parenting sessions that we do. We're going to talk about the topic of spanking today.
Right.
And every time we talk about spanking, it always makes me think of this time. My goodness, it's probably been 8 years ago or so, when we were invited to do a presentation about our book at a local church, and we were getting it all set up and everything, and everything was going well. And then right at one of the last things that the person asked me as we were setting it up on the phone, she asked me, now, you're not going to tell the congregation, you're not going to tell them that they can't spank, are you? And it introduced an interesting conversation because spanking is in many ways, it's a cultural thing. In many ways, it's just a handed down, parent after parent after parent way to manage behavior.
Right. It's a cultural thing. My parents spanked me and I'm okay. That's usually what we hear.
Yeah.
And so, but spanking is not just a problem, and I mean problem. Spanking is not just a problem in this country, it's a problem worldwide.
Right.
UNICEF and other international organizations have investigated this thing for many, many years now, many decades. Right. And worldwide, it's a problem. Protecting children from abuse, and again, we're not talking about abuse, but we're talking about how do you avoid abuse if you allow spanking. Is it okay? Can spanking ever be okay? Right. And if you read the articles by advocates of spanking, including I'm not talking about parents who are arguing. I'm talking about thoughtful people, other professionals who believe in spanking. Their arguments are very, very, very delicate. How do you draw the line between spanking as an acceptable form of discipline and spanking that's done out of anger? And it's very difficult to parse that. And so, even when you argue for spanking, it is becoming a more and more difficult argument to make.
Absolutely. And the reason that we're talking about it today is because perhaps there's some new evidence to make that that argument, the argument for spanking, to make that even more difficult. And there was a recent article published in the Lancet that we're going to talk about today, with some interesting findings that in fact spanking may make behavior worse.
Yeah, we used to argue years ago. We would argue that spanking wasn't really effective. Right. That was the argument that many of us. Well, in addition to hurting another person, because that's what spanking is intended to do, in addition to the physical pain that it causes both the child and the parent, we would make the argument that it really isn't. There are other things you can do that would be more effective. Right. If you want to change a person's behavior, there are many other ways to do it, and there were probably more effective ways than spanking. But today, with this recent article in the Lancet, spanking is not only less effective, it might actually make things worse.
Right.
And so that's another layer to think about.
Absolutely. And as we go into this discussion, I think that it's important to say, and I'll just speak for myself, and you can comment on how you wish. I was spanked growing up. And I've never been one to say, well, I was spanked when I grew up and I turned out okay. So, I've never gone that far. However, I will admit that there were times when my kids were much younger, there were times that I had spanked them. It was just a handful of times. It didn't happen many times. but certainly not nearly as many times as it happened to me. But it did happen. And yes, then you start figuring out, okay, there's got to be a better way to do this. And then you shift away from that mode of discipline. But go into this recognizing that I've done this, I've spanked, and it didn't really have any more of an effect from my experience than anything else that I tried.
Right.
So,
yeah, and you learn that over time, because if you're spanking a child more than once, one of the things we used to say is, when I was in school, paddling was allowed. It's still allowed in 19 states. Schools are still allowed to use corporal punishment. But it was the same 4 or 5 boys who were paddled. It's like not I mean, it was only a handful of boys. None of the girls were paddled. It was only a handful of boys, but it was the same 4 or 5 boys who got paddled repeatedly, which logically you say, well, if I have to keep paddling, maybe if I have to keep paddling the same people, it's not working.
For the same things. And it's the same thing that we do with suspending, right? It's typically the same kids that are suspended repeatedly. So obviously suspending them from school isn't effective.
Right, you have a handful of kids who were suspended, and they're the same kids.
Every time.
Year after year, they have the same kids, right? So the first question we ask is, it's a funny question. Who invented spanking? It's like a Pop-Tart, who invented the Pop-Tart? Well, who invented spanking? We have no idea. Spanking's been around it goes back to prehistory, before we had writing. And so there are biblical references to it. There are references from ancient Egypt, China, India, even pre-Columbian America. Go back to ancient Greece and Rome. And there are references to parents using some type of corporal punishment with their children. So it seems like it's always been around. So then the first thing we have to do is we have to justify punishment. Okay. And typically what you hear from parents who believe in corporal punishment is, well, we have to have consequences.
Right.
And you and I have been through this. We walked through this very slowly when we were writing the handbook.
Right.
Okay, we all agree that we have to have consequences, but what are your consequences meant to accomplish?
Right.
And what we do is that, well, the military uses punishment. Sports teams, coaches they use running laps and doing push-ups and different kinds of things. But in those institutions, you need to have absolute discipline.
Right.
If you're in the military, the goal is, if you're given an order, you have to obey it.
Right. There's no individuality in those areas. In those areas, the expectation is that you're going to conform and you're going to be just like we are telling you to be.
That's right.
And it's different at home.
Right. Even in the military.
Yeah.
Now that we have an all volunteer army, but in those institutions where take a football team, for example, or a baseball team. If a football player decides he doesn't want to do his assignment, the whole thing is going to break down. Okay. So that's a very different structure than home, because most homes, and I would say most schools, are not military units, and they're not athletic teams. Okay? So whatever we do there has to be a little bit different than what we do in a sports team or in the military. So because homes and schools are neither, now we ask the question, what do you want your punishment to do? What do you want your consequences to do? Are you just and you have to think, parents and teachers have to think about that. Are you developing consequences just to get obedience? Is that what you're after? Are you after adherence? We hear parents, we frequently will hear parents and teachers say, well, he doesn't go to bed on time, or he doesn't do his chores, or he doesn't do his chores properly. Okay. So you're not following the rules. Okay. Do you have consequences for that? Or are you trying to get respect? Are you going to have consequences to get respect? Or are you going to have consequences to as the price that your children or your students pay for making a mistake? You know,
Right.
you spilled your milk, or you broke a window, or you wrecked the car. Is the consequence meant to exact some price that you never do it again? So the
Yeah.
first question you ask, what is your purpose in having consequences?
Right. And I think that another important difference between that we need to make with these is, we talk about physical punishment, physical
Mhm.
consequences being present in the military and in sports teams and things like that. But you used a word just a moment ago, and you used it very quickly, because you were talking about something I had mentioned. But I think that it's a key to why homes and schools are different, and that is that military and sports teams are voluntary. If you go into the military and you don't like the way that they're treating you, you can get out of the military.
Right.
If you join a sports team and you don't like the way they're treating you, you can quit a sports team. You can't quit your home. You can't quit school.
It's not voluntary, right?
You're there involuntarily for the most part, right?
Right.
If we want to use those kinds of
Right.
difficult words.
Mhm.
And so that does make it very different.
Right.
What would happen if you were at work? Parents like to use these kinds of things. Well, I got to teach him for the real world. What would happen if you were at work and you made a mistake and your boss spanked you? That would be a very different, right? That not only would that be a lawsuit, but it would, we would never allow that to happen.
Mhm.
But then we do that with kids.
Yeah, we would dream. You spank another adult, and you're going to end up in jail.
Right.
You spank a child, and you're patted on the back.
Right.
Um, so, so first of all, we have to think about why do you have? We have the argument of we have to have consequences, and we think of punishment as consequences. So then we move to the specific issue of physical punishment.
Right.
Okay, and physical punishment would be everything from a mild tap on the hand. No, don't do that, like you see parents do with kids, or teachers, sometimes will do that. And so we have everything from a mild tap to execution. Okay, it runs the whole gamut. Okay, so when we talk about physical punishment, there's a social role that it plays.
Mhm.
Okay, you have to have obedience.
Right.
Okay, so we use physical punishment to get obedience, and all you have to do is think about the history of slavery or the history of military. The word decimate, was used um, in the Roman legions. Okay, to have discipline, to get obedience, and decimate was you would kill every 10th soldier just to show them that you mean business. And so one reason for physical punishment is obedience. Another is deterrence.
Right.
In our country, we have capital punishment. We still have the death, one of the few industrialized nations that still has a death penalty. And we believe that it's important to deter people from committing crimes, or for repayment for committing a crime. Your crime was so heinous that we have to kill you. Okay.
Right.
So,
And I think that I think deterrence and repayment are very commonly used.
mhm.
Parents will even say, yes, obedience is a very common reason why parents use spanking, but deterrence is also there because they say, well, I got to let him know that this is what's going to happen if he does that again.
And others who are watching, other
Right.
criminals who, look what we're going to do to this guy.
Right.
But crime rates continue. They're either level or they're increasing. And
Right.
so, is it working? And the last is intolerance. You are so bad that we can no longer have you among us. You're so horrific that we have to take you off the planet.
Right.
We have to get rid of you altogether because we can't have you. So we're gonna try to incarcerate you to keep you apart from us. And
Right.
if that doesn't work, then we'll execute you. So that's the final way of removing you from our presence. Okay.
Right.
So those are the social roles that punishment can play. Also, physical punishment, is sort of location specific.
Right.
In institutional settings, for many, many years, it was possible to use physical punishment And we have the very we had a case in Florida, the Dozier School for Boys,
Mhm.
where kids were probably literally beaten to death, punished to death. And now we're hearing about the um, Native American schools in Canada where
Mhm.
they're uncovering mass graves. I mean, these are tragic episodes of physical punishment gone awry.
Right.
So in institutional settings, it's a lot easier. In schools, 19 of our states, 19 of 50 states, still allow some form of corporal punishment.
Right.
And it's funny because the objects we use for physical punishment, I always get a kick out of this um, with slaves. If you damaged a slave, you reduced the slave's value. And
Mhm.
so a slave that was marked by being whipped or beaten would reduce the slave value. So they were constantly searching for physical punishments that would not leave permanent marks. And
Right.
that's why they started using straps instead of whips, and paddles, the other objects. And the reason paddles were first used was to prevent the sting in the hand of the paddler. So I don't want to hurt my hand. I don't want my hand to sting. So I'll use some other object, and hence we introduce paddles. And so corporal punishment is still allowed in states, and um, spanking in all states. Parents, I know in this state, parents are allowed to use physical punishment.
Sure.
And some parents believe it's their obligation to use physical punishment.
And there's not a clear line between when it's spanking and when it's abuse.
Right.
There's not a clear line there, and that creates problems.
Mhm.
Not just for the parent to know what's allowable and not allowable, but also for the system, the legal system, to know, okay, that's where you cross the line.
Right.
And so, yeah, that makes it really difficult. So in this study that we're going to talk about, it was a recent study about spanking published in the Lancet, which is a very highly reputable journal that publishes articles of all kinds. They're not specific to one particular discipline, but and this Gershoff,
Right.
Elizabeth Gershoff is the author, and she's been looking at spanking for 15 years. So she's if there's an expert. She's certainly among them.
Mm-hmm. Yes, she is. She's been doing this a long time. And what she did in this study, and it's an international group. The other thing about this study is that it's an international group of scholars, all specialists in this area. And they reviewed 69 studies that address this issue of spanking, and published it in a recent issue of the Lancet, which is a British medical journal, been around for, oh my gosh, hundreds of years.
Yeah, it's been
At least
around a long time.
Yeah, been around a long time. And so the main finding of their analysis, because what they wanted to do was go through all these studies and say, okay, let's take another look at spanking, because I think most professionals, I think it's safe to say that most professionals, child psychologists, pediatricians, are opposed to corporal punishment and in institutional settings, and spanking in homes.
Right.
And so the main finding of the study is, they say, unfortunate, and I'm quoting from the article, unfortunately for parents who hit, our research found clear and compelling evidence that physical punishment does not improve children's behavior and instead makes it worse.
Right.
And I think the key finding here is instead makes it worse.
Right.
Okay. So physical punishment continues to be seen as violence that harms children. When we talk about, you mentioned a minute ago, if a boss spanked an adult worker, there would be a lawsuit.
Right.
Okay. This is violence against another person. When you're hitting another person, it's violence against another person.
Right.
And so physical punishment is seen as violence that harms children.
Right.
The narrative, their review summarizes these studies, and it takes studies that are longitudinal.
Right.
And I think that's the other important key here, is what they did is they studied kids across time.
Yeah, I think that that's an important piece. We have to talk about the methodology just a little bit, because, oftentimes when we talk about studies, many times they're surveys, or they are, sort of snapshots in time. And what they did was they looked at studies, about 69 studies that were longitudinal in nature. So that means that they began when a kid was a particular age and monitored that each child over a long period of time to see what changed and what happened. And there's some really, massive longitudinal studies that are ongoing. It will forever be ongoing for the most part. They are renewed every year, and they start at birth, and parents can enroll themselves and their kids into these studies. But when you look at some of these studies, they're really challenging to do. But they decide at the beginning, what characteristics, what data they want to collect, and they collect them over a period of years. And with these studies that they reviewed for this article, these were all studies that they looked over a period of time to see what effect or what relationship there is between parents who spank their kids and those kids' behaviors.
And how they turn out when 10 years later. Okay? Longitudinal research is very, very difficult to do. It's very time consuming, it's very expensive. People drop out of the study, researchers, And so I'm always impressed when I see a longitudinal study, because that means somebody has dedicated years and years and years of work. And when you do those longitudinal studies, you're actually studying the same person over time. So it's not, and that's the best way to answer these questions, is by longitudinal study, because you have kids who were treated a certain way at age 2, and now you're looking at them at age 15.
Right.
That's very helpful.
Right, because if you think about it the other way around, if you just assess them at 15, you could say, okay, what were you spanked as a child? Yes, and here's your behavior now. Okay. But you don't know what that person's behavior was like when they were 6.
That's right. You're relying on memory.
Right. And their behavior could have been very different at that age. They could have, and so looking at them over time, you can see how the child's behavior changes over time. And you can see how it relates to some of these other variables like spanking
Right. And conversely, you can take a teenager who's very aggressive, and you ask that teenager about, let's say the parents aren't around anymore, and you ask that teenager, well, were you spanked as a child? And again, you're relying on that child's report, and that child's report may not be accurate.
Right.
Whereas if you're studying that child and you know what happened at 3, and then you see that child at 15, you can make a better correlation. It may not be completely accurate, it's going to be more accurate.
Right.
And so I'm impressed that they use 69 longitudinal studies. That's an enormous amount of probably high quality research information. Okay. So now the other thing, just to clarify, is they deleted studies of that included what we would consider abuse. Okay, hitting, punching, slapping in the face, hitting with a fist. Okay, that's different than spanking. Washing a child's mouth out with soap, throwing the child onto the floor, burning, threatening with a gun. And as incredible as that seems, that there are parents who threaten with lethal objects. So all of those studies were deleted. So we're only talking about spanking, which is another very good decision in this study, is they've gotten rid of all that stuff. So we're just talking about what most people would consider acceptable spanking.
Right. Yeah. And so in addition to that, the main finding that doesn't, not only is it not helpful, but it could make things worse. There were 7 other sort of themes to the study, themes to the review that they provided. And the first one is that physical punishment pretty consistently can predict increases in the child's behavior problems. And this is over time. So, what we've talked about before is that many times parents use spanking because it has an immediate effect. If the child is doing something you don't want him or her to do, and you spank that child, typically that behavior stops in the immediate.
Right.
But what, again, one of the themes of the study is that over time, though, the child's behavior problems increase. They happen more frequently. They may stop in the immediacy of the spanking, but as far as things like antisocial behavior, disruptive behaviors at school, and things like that, being argumentative and oppositional and those kinds of things, those behaviors continue, not just continue, but they increase over time. So we have to, we're not really good in this country with the idea of prevention. We tend to be very reactive, which is exactly what spanking is. Spanking is reactive, but we don't always think about what happens in the long term. And this is a great finding of this study.
Right. That's right. Actually, the first and second findings are sort of comparable in that the first finding says, if you spank, there's a greater likelihood that that's going to result in increased temper tantrums, oppositional behavior, argumentative behavior, more disruptive behavior at school. We're not saying that there's a direct, and there are going to be many examples where a child was spanked and none of these things happen.
Right.
All we're saying is there's a greater likelihood that these things will happen. And the more intense, the harsher, the more physical the punishment, the greater the likelihood.
Right.
Okay. And so, and that's the first thing. And then the second finding of the study is it's not associated. Physical punishment is not associated with positive outcomes.
Right.
Okay? You're more likely to get negative outcomes, and it's not associated. There's very little to suggest that if you spank your child, you're going to get positive outcomes, whatever you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah. So again, if you're looking for any benefit or any rationale for using spanking as a form of discipline, just those first two should rule spanking out.
Right.
And there's 5 more. there are 5 other.
If you need more, right?
Right. And the third one is maybe perhaps obvious, and that is that you're at much greater risk for the involvement of child protective services.
Right.
And that makes sense. So, but people should be aware that that's, the research does support that that's going to happen, or you're at greater risk for that happening.
Exactly. Right. And then a fourth is, why are kids getting spanked? They're getting spanked for externalizing behaviors.
Right.
What we have to remember is that there are internalizing behaviors and there are externalizing behaviors. And physical punishment is associated more with externalizing behaviors. Kids who will be argumentative, kids who will physically do something, hit, bite, etc. It's more likely to get it for that. But remember, kids also have internalizing behaviors that we need to be aware of. Right. And if kids are externalizing, probably the worst thing you can do is use externalizing punishments to deal with externalizing behaviors. Right. Well, that child hit me, so I have to hit the child back, or the child bit me, so I have to bite the child. You're headed in the wrong direction.
Right.
Okay? So remember that you have both internalizing and externalizing.
Right. The fifth is kind of delves into the world of research methodology just a little bit, but it is important, and that is that when they look at the effects of physical punishment predicting a worsening of the child's behavior over time, this is a result of looking at what they call quasi-experimental studies, and what that sort of the abridged version or explanation of what that means is that when we think about research studies that compare 2 groups, one of the things we do is we try to compare groups that are different in some way. And so, like, if we're looking at a medication, we'll give one group the actual medication, we'll give the other group the placebo, and the participants have no idea if they're getting the real medication or the placebo, and then we give it to them over time and we see how it changes their behavior or changes whatever symptom we're looking for. With quasi-experimental studies, we can't have that. It means that we can't have that kind of control. And so instead, people go into groups based upon what they're already doing. And so they will enroll these families into the studies. And if the parents say, yes, we use spanking, they go into the spanking group. And if they say, no, we don't use spanking, they go into the non-spanking group. And then they monitor them over time. So the researchers aren't putting them in the research groups that they're in. They're just sort of naturally going into those groups because of what they already do. That was sort of the quick and dirty for research methodology there for you. Thank you all for showing up for class today.
Is this going to be on the test?
That's right. Those studies are really good in some ways, and they're a little bit limited in other ways because, clearly, if the researcher doesn't have control over what group they go in,
right,
people go where they go. But they're really powerful because we can, again, look at the same kids over a period of time, and we can say this group of kids who were spanked are different from this group of kids who were not spanked, and we can look at those differences.
Not every kid, but groups of kids.
Right.
So we're saying in general, this is what we're finding, okay? And we can also put the 6th and 7th findings together. The 6th is, it doesn't matter what the child's characteristics or the parent characteristics are. Regardless of child or parent characteristics, the results hold that physical punishment is detrimental to child outcomes. Okay, whatever else you can say about the race, the age, the background, the religious affiliation, despite all those characteristics, the finding still holds. That's important. And the last one is there's a dose-response relationship.
Yeah.
And I think what they mean there is that the harsher the punishment, the worse the outcome.
Right.
Okay. So as you get to true physical abuse, you increase the likelihood of a detrimental outcome.
Right. The more often and the more severe the physical punishment, the more likely the negative outcome, the worsening of the child's behavior. So,
that reminds me of a study that was reported, I think about 4 years ago, may have been longer than that, and I believe the number's right, 12 spankings a year over I think a 2-year period. There was a study done. It was reported, I think, by NIH, National Institutes of Mental, NIMH. 12 spankings a year over a several-year period resulted in reduced gray matter in the brain. And so there are true biological effects of punishment. I had forgotten about that study, but it was actually reduced gray matter that is related to spankings, not physical abuse, but spankings. And I think it was 12 a year over a 2 or 3 year period was enough to do physical damage to the brain.
Man, I get that many in a week sometimes. So just these, it was rough. So despite these identified limitations to spanking, the fact that it doesn't help, that it could make things worse, and that there's the evidence that it could make things worse for the child is you just can't really argue. The research findings are pretty consistent.
Right.
Despite all of that, it's still a very prevalent use of form of discipline. Most countries still allow it. So more than the vast majority of children live in countries where spanking is allowed. All of the states in the United States allow it, as you said earlier, and there's still 19 states that still allow schools to paddle. So it's it's still a very common and pervasive tool.
Yeah, and yet the good news is that 62 I didn't know there were that many. 62 countries prohibit the physical punishment of children. There are several European countries My brother lives in Germany, and he said they're very much more opposed there. That 62 countries actually prohibit the physical punishment of children, even by parents.
Right.
Okay, and um, and yet only 13% of the world's children are fully protected from corporal punishment. And even more surprising, 31 countries still allow whipping, flogging, and caning,
Right.
hitting with a stick.
Yeah.
I have to be careful of identity here, so I'm going to be a little bit vague, but I talked to a person recently who went to school and taught in a country in Asia. And he was forced to cane his students, to hit them with a stick, or lose his job. And they came into his classroom and said, "You do this, or you're not going to be teaching here anymore."
Right.
And he left. But he was forced to use a cane on his students, and he was teaching young kids,
Right.
and they had to use a cane.
Yeah.
Remember reading and writing and arithmetic done to the tune of a hickory stick?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hickory stick was a cane, and
Yeah.
that's what we used. And so 31 countries still allow whipping, flogging. Bernie, when did the Supreme Court of the United States said you can no longer execute children in this country?
It wasn't long ago.
2003 or 2005.
Yeah, early 2000s. Yeah.
Right. So it's not that long ago.
Right.
So there is this commission called the Convention on the Right of the Child of the UN General Assembly that says corporal punishment and other cruel or degrading forms of punishment should be done away with. Corporal punishment should be done away with. That's according to the UN General Assembly, rights of the child. And I mention this because it wasn't that long ago that we were having the same conversation about the rights of racial minorities or the rights of women.
Right.
You know, it's been not long ago where we were talking about the rights of individuals with handicapping conditions, individual with racial differences, and sex differences.
Right.
And now we're talking about providing those same rights to children.
Right.
And some people find that abhorrent, you know, the mere thought that we would give children rights. Well, like it or not, children, right? I think now, currently, children is the next group that we're going to have to begin to recognize that they deserve the same rights as other individuals. You know,
right. The right for protection and the right to, you know, the right to be safe, and the right to not be not to not be harmed, and to not be treated in some of these cruel ways. And you know, people, it doesn't. There's not much digging that one would need to do to find evidence of pretty severe child treatment. And I'm not even just talking about, you know, sexual abuse and things like that. You know, there are very recent reports of people who, you know, they have a child and they lock the child in a room, and that child stays in the room their entire life. And so, yeah, there's going to be more and more of a movement in the direction of protecting kids, not just from those really severe, extreme situations, but it's going to have to include some of these, you know, more commonly used forms of discipline and management, because again, as the evidence continues to mount that it's not effective, at some point somebody's going to have to say, look, we got to stop doing this. It has to end.
Right. And children, like everybody, children deserve the dignity of not being struck by another person, hit by another person. We accord that to everybody else.
Right.
I'm going to accord it to children. Okay. We acknowledge that children, it's not easy being a parent. We all know that. Okay. From birth to the time they leave our homes. Right. It is a tough job. We all get that. But that doesn't give you the right
Right.
to treat them differently than you would treat anybody else in your life.
Right. Yeah.
And so when we get to this last part, you know, if you're not going to spank, what else can you do? And that's the question. Well, if I can't spank, what else? What are my options? I have to have discipline. We agree. I have to have consequences. We agree. What are my other options? Well,
Right.
we acknowledge that parenting is difficult and it requires much more time, attention, and thoughtfulness than many parents. And I'm not saying that they're not willing to do it. I think most parents don't realize how that these other things exist and all the other things that you can do. I think it's a skill deficit, not an attitude deficit.
Right. And I think that, you know, some of these other things that we're going to talk, you know, can kind of allude to could be almost a completely separate podcast, because, you know, when we think about other strategies to use, other management tools to use, you know, you have to think about everything from how are you setting up the environment? You know, what are your expectations? You know, what are your expectations, and then what kind of tools are you giving the kid to manage those expectations? You know, all of those things come before the behavior even happens. Those are called antecedents.
Right. Yeah. And I agree totally. What we do other than punish is at least one more podcast and maybe a series of podcasts. Yeah. Because you have, what do you do with an infant? What do you do with a 3-year-old? What do you do with an 8-year-old? Okay. So to introduce that notion, we have narrowed it down to parenting is a series of thoughtful actions, and it's as easy as ABC. Think about this, ABC, okay? So what does the A stand for? The A stands for antecedents. In our business, antecedents are all the things you do before the behavior occurs. And your first job is you have to create an environment. What's the environment that you want to live in? Okay, do you want a peaceful, quiet, orderly? You have to decide ahead of time. How do we want to live? You can't have a chaotic environment and get obedience or compliance with punishment. If the environment is chaotic, behavior is going to be chaotic. Okay, so decide what kind of environment you want. Second, have a schedule. In this family, this is how we do things. I use the example of, in our family, we went to church every Sunday, usually at the same time. Mm-hmm. We weren't punished to go. It's just what you did every Sunday. We went to my grandparents for Sunday dinner at noon. Nobody had to apply discipline. It was just what the schedule was.
Right.
And if you think about that, when do you go to bed? When do you go to sleep? When do you get up in the morning? When do you go to church? You know, what is your weekly schedule? Do you have a weekly schedule? Because kids will adjust to that weekly schedule. If this is what we do, it's like going to school. You know, starting in August, kids are going to get up and they're going to go to school.
Right.
Okay? It's just what you do. And so you have to set up a household where this is just what we do. Not all families go to church on Sunday mornings. Some go on Friday nights. If you're Jewish, you go on Friday night. Okay. But this is what we do on Friday night. You're not punished to do it. It's just what you do.
Right. Now, the B
right
in the ABCs is behaviors.
That's right. What are kids doing?
And the key, I think, here, and we talk about this a lot in our book, is you need to know what is and is not developmentally appropriate. And I think that's something that I think a lot of parents really struggle with, because especially first-time parents or parents, you know, as they're working with their oldest child, because what is appropriate for a 3-year-old is very different than what's appropriate for an 8-year-old, which is very different than what's appropriate for a 15-year-old. Mm-hmm. But knowing what is developmentally appropriate is going to allow you to gauge, this is something that I need to address, and this is something that I don't need to address. this would be considered misbehavior or unusual or abnormal behavior, and this is considered typical behavior. This is something that, maybe I do something about, but I don't have to punish. This is part of that typical developmental process. But you have to know that you have to have that sort of anticipatory guidance. You have to know what it is that is expected and what is typical at different ages and at different places and stages of a child's life, so that you can gauge between what needs a consequence and what doesn't.
Right. Yeah, because we can say to parent, and we've done this, these are the things that a child should be able to do by the 5th year of life. These are the things that they should be able to do by age 8. Okay. But you have to know what those things are, and you accomplish that. So we say to parents, okay, your child should be able to do this by age 8, but you have 3 years to get there. You don't have to do it right now. You have time to get there. So do it carefully, do it thoughtfully, and do it without punishment. Punishment is just a quick and dirty way to be a parent.
Right.
It's a quick fix, but that's not what parenting is. It's not a quick fix. It takes years and years and years of thoughtful effort. Absolutely. And thoughtful approaches. Right. And so, yeah, what are we reacting to? It might be age-appropriate behavior.
Right.
My goodness, you wouldn't want to punish somebody for age-appropriate behavior.
Absolutely. And then the C for the ABCs is the consequence. And, the idea for consequence, we tend to think of consequences as punishment. And consequences can be any number of things. Consequence could be, let me teach you something different. Let me show you how to do that. That's a consequence. If you don't know how to add 5 plus 3, and I sit down and show you how to add 5 plus 3, my teaching you is a consequence for you not knowing how to do that. So consequence is just something that happens after the behavior. That's all a consequence is. And, I know that there's lots that could be talked about with consequences, because there's lots of different ways to apply a consequence. But, one of the really critical things I think that parents have to recognize is that many times, most of the time, if not every time, the consequence that you apply to a behavior typically becomes the antecedent for the next behavior.
Right.
So if your child does something and you say something or you do something as a form of a consequence, your child's going to respond to that, which means that your consequence then becomes the antecedent for the next behavior.
That's right.
And that changes.
Right. That's right. And that's what you want to break. You want to break that cycle.
Right.
Because if your consequence is physical punishment, you now you're setting the stage for the child's next behavior.
Right.
And it might be compliance, and it might be fear, and you don't know what it's going to be. Yeah. You can't predict. Now, what these studies say, what this study is saying is, we would predict that it wouldn't go well.
Right.
That's what they're saying. Okay. So when you punish a child physically, use physical punishment, I don't know what the child's going to do next.
Right. Right.
They may hit you back. They may cry. They may be afraid. We don't know.
Right.
Chances are it's not going to go well.
Right. What these research articles, research studies presented in this article suggest is that it's going to lead to, over time, it's going to lead to worsening behavior.
Right. That's right.
And so there's pretty strong evidence that that's what it's going to lead to.
Right.
If we're not careful. So, shifting away, and maybe we need to do a series of podcasts about developing appropriate consequences, talking about, what are naturally occurring consequences? What are, how do you set up a system where your child helps you develop consequences for behavior that's problematic? Maybe we can set up that over the next couple of weeks and do some of those podcasts. So.
Exactly. Yeah, I think we should probably spend some time doing that.
Absolutely.
And certainly we'd love to hear from listeners, any suggestions that you may have.
Definitely.
Appreciate hearing them.
Definitely. So the link, there's a link to an article in the show notes from CNN that kind of summarizes the Lancet article. Check it out. It's a good description. It has some pretty neat pictures, old timey pictures of spanking and stuff.
Some of those things are really, they're humorous.
Yeah, but yeah.
Don't do this at home.
That's right. So, all right. Well, That's it then for today. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.